So tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce Frank Davis, our seminar speaker tonight. Frank is a professor of environmental science and management at the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara. And Frank has been involved in lots of different things over his career there. From plant ecology, many of you probably know his studies on oaks. And Frank has also been the director at NCES, which is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at UCSB, for quite a while. Frank, I got to know Frank more recently in the last couple of years. Frank is the head of the Long-Term Ecological Research Network Communications Office, and he and I worked on that together. And then more recently, Frank has just accepted a new directorship position as the director of the Lacretz Research Center at the UCSB Sedgwick Reserve. And the Sedgwick Reserve is one of our sister reserves at UC Santa Barbara. It's out in the San Ynez Valley. So I'm really delighted to have Frank here, and Frank's going to be talking about a plant's eye view of climate change in the California mountains.
Great, thanks. Do I have a pointer?
You know what? You do. Let me just turn this on for you. So that's...
Oh, there you go. Cool. Hi. How's the sound? I'm going to talk about microclimate rather than climate change. We'll be talking about microclimate change. And to start, I want to actually do a little pop quiz. Multiple choice. Everybody passes. Don't worry about getting the right answer. Since 1950, global surface temperature has warmed by around. I'm showing you these numbers in part because we'll be talking about temperature variation across landscapes in the Sierras and the Tehachapi. So I'm trying to put the temperature variation in those landscapes in perspective. So get a sense of the kinds of numbers we're talking about for warming since 1950 on the global scale. How about California? So the first message is obviously when they talk about global warming, we really need to think about the variation in warming across the planet. It is quite different in different places. Now, there are a lot of other trends in California that if you're concerned with things like agriculture or water supply or biodiversity, so winter chill, basically orchard winter chill hours have decreased by 50 to 500 hours per decade since 1950. Frost days have decreased by 1/2 to 1.5 days per year. Water deficit, which is a measure of the sort of droughtiness of the climate, the degree to which the soil is too dry to provide water to plants in the atmosphere, has increased. And I show this map for the water deficit because it shows that when you get to things like water and precipitation, it's kind of more variable across the state. Some places have even maybe gotten a little less droughty, while other places, most of the state has gotten droughtier. Now, does it mean anything for plants and animals? This is a complicated thing to answer. For most plants and animals, what people have tried to look at, has this warming, has this change in drought conditions affected plants and animals? And the answer is hard to say. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but a lot of other things have happened in California. We've had changes in fire regime, changes in human land use patterns and populations and how they're distributed across the state, air quality, and so forth. There are a few sentinel species and systems where you can certainly see a signal. The butterflies are probably the best example where there's been a pretty systematic uphill shift in the distribution of butterflies. This is the Edith checkerspot butterfly, which is an endangered species. And then there are also some specific varieties of grapes and honeysuckle and lilacs and things that people actually monitor to see how they're changing over time in terms of their phenology. This is kind of an interesting paper by Dan Cahan and others that shows that if you look at wine grape flowering in the Napa Valley, it's precessed. It's about a month earlier now than it was in 1950. Similarly, the flowering dates for these ornamental honeysuckles have precessed. They're on average flowering about a month earlier. So these are definitely trends that signal some kind of biological response to the warming in California. Last question, this isn't multiple choice, this is just take a guess because it really, there's quite a range in estimates, but if we think about compared to the late 20th century, what is regional climate going to look like by 2045, 2050, 2055? And just to give you a sense of it, this is from work by Alex Hall, a collaborator of mine down at UCLA. He runs these regional models. The range for 19 different models with different emission scenarios and so forth is somewhere between 3 degrees Fahrenheit and 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what the model averages. It's about not quite twice as fast as the warming we saw in the late 20th century. So it's getting warmer faster is the point. And Alex makes a nice visualization out of this because one of the things he cares about, if this is LA, that's the San Gabriel Mountains. He said, suppose we had the same snow event in the mid-century that we had at the end of the 20th century, what would it look like? And that's what it would look like by comparison, sort of as just a way to think about some of the implications of this climate change. Now, I'm mainly concerned with oak woodlands and rangelands and the forest systems of California. Like this picture of Sedgwick Reserve, one of my favorite places in the state. You don't see a lot of people in the picture. I've really been looking more at kind of public land systems and wildland systems. And there's still a lot of reasons why we really do care what climate change is doing to affect these forest and rangeland systems. You can think about water supply, and that's certainly probably our single biggest concern is just the change in snowpack, and you've heard from Jeff Dozier about that, I think probably a couple weeks ago, about some of the implications of our changing snowfall versus rainfall patterns. And water supply, certainly there's a change in wildfire risk and timber and forage production in these systems and their ability to sequester carbon. In recreational opportunities, I don't need to tell this group that, if you're thinking about where you live. And also, my main concern has been really with this one, with extinction of species. Does climate change actually create enough disruption to these systems that species could actually disappear from California? And because California is such a globally significant hotspot of biodiversity, I think it's an important question to ask. This is one of my study sites up on Tejon Ranch, where over the last few years during the drought, we've seen this the dieback and actually complete mortality of ponderosa pine on the ranch there. But that's just an indication of sort of a local response to an unusually warm, dry string of years. If we think about more long-term climate change, how do species respond? They can either tolerate it because they're able to tolerate warmer or drier or wetter conditions. They may be able to actually genetically adapt through really rapid selection and evolution if they have enough of those kind of the variation in the local populations. They may migrate, which means literally just a longer-term regional change in their distribution and abundance, or they go locally extinct. The way we, as kind of people studying this effect of climate change on wild species, think about it is we start with a really simple view of the future of these species. This is an example for Pinus sabiniana, the great pine or foothill pine, where what you do is you look at all the places where the species currently occurs, and you say, what's the climate of that space that it currently occupies? What does it look like in terms of temperature and rainfall and so forth? And that would be the blue areas on the map that you see on the left would be our sort of climate range for foothill pine. The red areas, if I take the same climate space and I project it forward using the global models, downscale to California, that's where that same climate space would be by the end of the century, 2070 to 2099, under a set of climate models, and they're just models. But the main point there is that what you would expect with many of the species in California is you'll see both a sort of an upslope and a northern shift in the climate space for species. That's actually a very large shift over a relatively short period of time. And you have to think about the fact that if a species is going to shift that's a long-lived tree species like that, everything has to work right. It's got to be able to flower, fruit, disperse seeds, establish seedlings, grow individuals, be participating in a population of the same species and so forth. Now we know plants can do this. They've actually adjusted many times historically to lots of variation in climate. Our biggest really major disruption recently was the end of the Pleistocene, the ice ages. And we can look, for example, at just the Owens Valley floor, where 16,000 years ago, that floor was a dense woodland of Utah juniper, mainly, at least based on the fossils out of Owens Lake. Now, Utah juniper, if you're going to try to find it now, you're going to go about another 2,000 to 2,500 feet higher, and you're going to be looking up in the White Mountains, and you're going to be looking in parts of the Eastern Sierra in a very different distribution. Instead, what the Owens Valley floor looks like now is a shad scale scrub. So we know plants can adjust to climate disruptions, but the question is how fast the climate changes versus how quickly the plants can move and respond. The problem there is this problem that's sort of in a cartoon form here. A species will have a certain range. They'll have local edges to that range and broader regional edges to that range. And in order to establish new populations, they have to do what? They have to get their seeds out into new microsites. So there's a dispersal problem in the first place. Those seedlings have to actually be able to germinate and establish and grow. Finding those microsites out ahead of a population, I like John Harper's, he said it's like a blindfolded hunter trying to shoot a single buffalo on an endless plain. They're just really these tiny little safe spots in the landscape where a seed could actually land, germinate, and grow. If you look at where the adults grow, and I think any of you who have done gardening and horticulture and so forth, you know this. It's hard to get them started. Once you get your trees and shrubs started, they can tolerate quite a lot. You can forget to water them for quite a while. So this figure on the upper right there is just showing that if I imagine an environmental gradient like temperature or moisture, like we're going from dry to wet, for example, the adult tolerance might be the red curve. It can tolerate a wide range of conditions. The conditions for the seedling to establish, on the other hand, is a much narrower range. So if I think about again, through time, as climate changes, you can imagine that every year the population's throwing seeds out there. And maybe on a good year, you'll get a little bump in the environmental quality for the seedling establishment. The adults, they're perfectly happy in most years. But it's those seedlings where you sort of ratchet the population into the landscape. It doesn't happen every year. It only happens on those occasional years when you can get enough rain or you can get it at the right conditions to do that. And of course, California's climate, as you know, is very spiky. Just take it from the governor. So these are opportunity years or episodes in which maybe plants can change their distribution in response to climate change. Unfortunately, if you're thinking about projecting the future of plants in California, you're working with very coarse climate models, sort of at the scale of the macroclimate to the mesoclimate in this diagram. At the least, we have to start to think about the local climates, and in particular, in mountains, we need to think about these sort of topoclimates of cooler north slopes versus warmer south slopes, and maybe ridges that have different conditions as well, cold air drainage in valleys. There's a number of climates within a landscape created by topography. And the hard part here is, if you can't probably even see the shading in here, but inside every one of these local climates is a series of microclimates. And that is the environment for the seedling or for an individual organism in general. It's not the forest. It's literally a little piece inside the forest. And so one of the things that we want to try to think about is how do we go from these macroclimates that are sort of the scale at which we think about climate change and take ourselves all the way down to the microclimate that tree seedlings, for example, would experience. If we can do that, maybe then we can think our way back up from tree seedling establishment to growth and reproduction to the whole population back to a range dynamic. The point of this little cartoon here is just to say when you have to change, a forest is lost here and you have to build a forest someplace else, you do it one tree at a time. You do it one seedling at a time. It takes an accumulation of these sort of good years and good sites to build up a range shift. And we know from the fossil record that it can happen. It can happen relatively fast, but still centuries to millennia to actually really create a large shift in the range of a tree. So Carol mentioned NCs. This is a place that has scientists to get together in working groups and think about problems. And this was a group that formed way back in 2005. We were all much younger and happier then. And here is Rebecca Shaw, who is the lead conservation scientist for California's the Nature Conservancy. And they had the problem of trying to say, we're making conservation investments in California. We're trying to think forward. We want to make investments in places where species will have the best chance of persisting and perhaps actually colonizing successfully. So the challenge that we were tasked with was, well, how do you think about that? How do you actually think about making conservation decisions and priorities at a fine enough scale to actually get some sense of a realistic view of the future? And in order to do that, you have to get to these sorts of local and microclimates. So we got together a group of atmospheric scientists, climatologists, plant ecologists, biogeographers. We were really quite a diverse group. And we decided we didn't really have enough in the literature to answer the question of how to do it, so we just wrote a proposal, and Malcolm North, who's sitting back there, was actually on this proposal with us to actually do empirical work in the field, measuring those seedling establishment sites and measuring climate at very local scales and microclimate scales, and see if we could actually model the future of these tree species under different kinds of climate projections at a scale that could inform conservation decision making. And so we did that with 4 field sites. One of them is the Tea Kettle Experimental Forest that Malcolm is the leader for, the San Joaquin Experimental Range, and then 2 sites on Tejon Ranch. And I'll show you pictures of all of these in a second. You'll get a sense of how diverse these landscapes are. This is just a kind of a quick view of the Tea Kettle Experimental Forest with white fir, red fir, Jeffrey pine. The Tejon Highlands is black oak and ponderosa pine. And then 2 foothill sites on Tejon Ranch, the blue oaks, and then the San Joaquin Experimental Range near Fresno, it's blue oaks and gray pines. These were landscapes where we actually put in experimental gardens and measured microclimate and tried to model those systems. And I'm going to cut to the chase, so I'm not going to show you all of the different climate stories and microclimate stories, but when you think about we put in experimental gardens and we planted seeds of 5 different species of trees, 3 pines and 2 oaks. And then we measured the microclimate across all these different sites, 24 experimental gardens, high elevation, low elevation, and said, what's the best way to predict whether a seed's going to germinate and establish a seedling? And the 2 best predictors were summer heat, not surprisingly perhaps in our Mediterranean climate. So it can be too hot in the summer for these seedlings in many of the sites we were looking at, and summer drought, just how much residual soil moisture is left through as the summer progresses. And I'll show you how we actually model those. This is just a cage showing down in the San Joaquin Experimental Range near Fresno where we had planted black oak acorns. They all germinated, even though it was way below the elevation zone for black oaks. They're capable of actually germinating. They just couldn't survive the summer because of the heat and drought. So, and that's an example where the same species of blue oaks and black oaks, when you put them up in tea kettle, up at 7,000 feet, and you plant in the same array, quite a few seedlings will survive and grow. So, quickly, I'm not going to get too technical here, but just we tried 2 different ways of getting those global climate models down to a more local scale. This is very kind of uncertain work, so it's really kind of what-if scenarios. You can't take these models too literally, but Alex Hall uses what are called dynamic regional models, where he actually simulates the atmospheric dynamics and the energy exchanges and the water exchanges and so forth in a simulation model. And he's done that all the way across all of the Sierras, all the way down to about a 2x2 kilometer cell, which is very high resolution. And then Alan and Laurie Flint use a different sort of statistical method of downscaling, where you take the topography and you essentially take coarse climate data, interpolate it, and drape it over the topography at finer scales based on statistical relationships between that topography, elevation, slopes, and so forth, and temperature and precipitation. The question we ended up with right away was, well, okay, that'll get us down to, in the case of the regional models, maybe a couple of kilometer grid cells. In the case of these statistical models, maybe 60, 100 meters on a side. How fine do we need to make them in order to actually have any predictive skill for establishing new plant populations under climate change? Do we need to do just the topography, these topoclimates, where you can see kind of the dry slopes and the cooler, moister north-facing slopes in a mosaic like this in the foothills? Do we need to worry about things like cold air pools? And what scale do we need to think about cold air pooling? Do we even need to get to the scale where we're thinking about the difference between a forest gap and a forest understory in order to predict outcomes for seed dispersal and establishment? So the answer is you got to get a really fine scale. Really fine scale. And in two different ways. One is, think about, this is a 3-year-old ponderosa pine seedling. That's all there is, folks. You know, it's 3 years old. It's got about a foot of above ground canopy, and it's got a couple of feet of below ground roots. So it's in a part of the soil column that dries out quickly, and it's next to the soil surface, and that part of the atmosphere that really gets hot. So I'm not going to belabor this diagram except to point out that both the minimum and the maximum air temperatures are most extreme right where that seedling canopy is placed. So not only do you have to think about it spatially, but you have to think about it vertically. And then also you got to think about the fact that when seedlings are establishing, they're looking up, and they may be surrounded by an existing vegetation that's shading them out. They may not have the ability to tolerate that much shade. And then just because plants create all sorts of interesting heterogeneity, as you know, and things like where snow persists, where it's accumulated, pockets of wetter and drier soil, there's an interaction between the vegetation and the local climate, and the seedlings are experiencing that kind of scale of climate variation where it's coupled to whatever vegetation's there. Very hard problem. So here's how we kind of looked at it. We built some experimental gardens like this. We surrounded the gardens with 20 temperature sensors right in the same height, a couple inches above the soil surface that the seedling canopy is sitting in, to measure the temperatures every 10 minutes throughout the year, inside and around the garden, and then also scattered. This is a picture from Tea Kettle. We had 24 of these gardens that we built, 6 for each of the sites, and we planted Jeffrey pines, ponderosa pine seeds, black oak seeds, blue oak seeds, and so forth in those gardens. Because we were interested in climate, we weren't interested in the fact that rodents will eat everything you put out there. This is metal flashing to try to keep things like squirrels and chipmunks out of there. We also had hardware cloth that was buried underground to keep the gophers out, which was successful only part of the time. You know what it's like trying to keep gophers out. Here's an example of, this is a sort of a level, or maybe perhaps a little cold air pooling site in that landscape. Here's an example of a garden in a north-facing slope. Here's an example of a garden at the same tea kettle landscape on a south-facing slope. So this is the kind of variation we were looking at. We also looked at the vertical distribution of temperature. So this is 4 meters above the ground. There's a temperature sensor here, and then there's one 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 here. So there's stacks. So we try to figure out what the temperature profile looks like as you go from right against the soil surface up into the free atmosphere. And let me just show you one data plot. I promise I won't hit you with a lot of data. But this is kind of telling. If you remember the numbers for warming projections for California into the middle of the century. So yeah, we're talking about on the order of perhaps 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, for example. If you think about going up and down a mountain, when you go 1,000 meters or 3,200 feet down elevation, it's going to warm somewhere around 5 or 6 degrees centigrade. This is our garden 6, where we have a north, a south, and a valley garden, a north, a south, and a valley garden. This is the average of all those temperature sensors. And we have what the temperatures look like 2 inches above or 5 centimeters above the soil surface for the month of July. These are daily, 2012. And what at the same location, 2 meters above the soil surface. Okay? So take a look. I'm going to just emphasize something here. It's about a 10 degree centigrade difference in the maximum daily temperatures on the soil versus here. 10 degrees centigrade. Okay, so the temperatures are actually getting up. This is in a Sierra conifer forest up to 45 degrees centigrade. If you want to think about that, that's well over 112 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. The other thing I'd point out that's kind of interesting and was most interesting to us is there is a pretty significant difference between the north slope maximum temperatures. They just never quite heat up as much as the valleys and the south slopes, which are almost identical to one another. By the time you get up here, the air is much better mixed, and there's hardly any difference at all that you can really detect between the different slopes. So I always think of cool north slopes and warm south slopes, but the fact is when you measure them, it's only when you get near the soil surface that you really see big differerences in these temperature regimes. Now I'm going to show you how we model that then. We take that sort of view of the atmosphere. Here's the North Fork of the Kings River. That's the Wishon Reservoir up there, if you all know that area. It's about 12 miles from this corner down to this corner. We're going from about 1,200 feet above sea level up to about a little under 7,000 feet here, just to give you some sense of the scale of all of this. So we take that landscape and then we say, let's use the standard interpolation. We'll model air temperature 2 meters above the ground surface. And this is routinely done to try to think about species exposure to climate change. And you take a model from the weather station data or from the global climate models, and you represent the atmosphere at this height above the surface. What's the problem with that story? That's not where the seedlings are going to be living. So when you think about what that looks like, it looks more like that. And so that's probably the way we have to think about these landscapes if we want to try to project forward what the heterogeneity in temperatures might look like. I'll just show you again. It's a much smoother looking landscape and it's a much cooler landscape until you go to the surface. And then it's both much more varied spatially and it gets a lot hotter. This is just the July 2012 surface temperatures I just showed you the data for. This is the same month in a model. Now, of course, we could just kill ourselves going to finer and finer scales. We're doing that. And the next step we're using is something called LIDAR imagery, where you can actually use a laser rangefinder that images the surface by hitting the surface with multiple laser hits and measures essentially the height of the surface from the laser instrument. And it lets you paint basically the three-dimensional structure of the forest. And this is an example of a cross-section. Here's the actual forest on the ground, and this is just a cross-section through that LIDAR imagery for that same area up at Tea Kettle. Get really amazing detail on the structure of the forest. And here's a place at San Joaquin, and that's that same site. You can see the blue oak canopies, and you know the height of the ground surface as well as the canopy surface. Now, I'm just going to cut to the chase on this one and say there's a lot more variation that we can actually model even if we have that kind of information about forest structure and topography. And a couple things, Malcolm has already discovered this when he was looking at microclimates up at Tea Kettle. There are certainly hotter places. The hottest places at any given cross-section of that landscape will be a south-facing slope and a forest gap, for example. Some of the coolest places will actually be down in these little ravines like Tea Kettle Creek here, which is a little cool spot where you'll get cold air drainage, and it actually didn't seem to heat up as much during the day. Now, this isn't actually from our data. This is just I'm using this as somebody else's cross-section, but it's pretty much summarizes the same thing we see. So you also see this really strong influence on the surface temperature shown here by hotter is red, bluer is cooler, of the gaps versus the denser forest and this topographic effect. So let me just summarize that bit. Basically, what we've seen is there's a lot more variation in maximum temperatures. Minimum temperatures, not so much. There's a lot of vertical variation. If you're a seedling or you're a lizard or you're something that's living on the ground surface, you're living in a pretty extreme environment. We can explain a lot of the variation with the models we're using now. So we can say that probably that topo climate scale, you know, the sort of the north slope, south slope variation, we can capture, that accounts for about half of the variation you see in surface temperatures. And if you're willing to do it and go down to the gap understory on a particular slope position, you can get almost all the way there. That's just one of those factors I mentioned. I'm going to do quickly another one, the soil moisture problem. So if you imagine in our Mediterranean climate, we get the winter and the spring rains, we get a snowpack accumulated, but then sort of you turn off the knob sometime in mid to late spring, and you use up all of that water over the course of a hot, dry summer. Where you are in that landscape makes a big difference in how fast you use up that water. And I can just show you as a picture here. Look at this is a Tejon Ranch. These squares are 3 of our gardens. This is a north-facing slope. This is a south-facing slope in May 2015. They're looking right across from one another. There's as much variation there in the soil moisture regime as you might predict at a regional scale in a climate model between now and the mid-century. These are fairly profound differences. So we needed to think about a way to try to capture that kind of variation in the landscape as well. Here's Tejon Ranch. If you're not familiar with it, it's a 270,000 acre privately owned ranch. It's the western Tehachapis. I'm just showing you for context. This is the San Joaquin Valley. This is the Antelope Valley over here. It's such a cool place. If you haven't had a chance to go there, pay a visit sometime. They have open houses where they actually give you tours. So this is the San Joaquin grassland side, looking up into Tejon Canyon. These are blue oak woodlands down low. This is what the highlands look like. I'm going to show you these landscapes in a model in a second. Black oak forest, incense cedar, ponderosa pine, black. And then on the other side of the ranch, you actually get into Antelope Valley grasslands and Joshua Tree woodlands. Quite a place. We modeled something called the water deficit, which is that little area in red. These are monthly temperature and precipitation, and it's just the balance essentially between the water supply and the water demand from the atmosphere. If you had the water, the atmosphere is always going to evaporate it, the plants are going to transpire it. How much water is there for the plants in the atmosphere to use? If there's more than enough, you've got a surplus of water. If there's not enough, you've got a deficit of water, where there's more demand from the atmosphere for water than the soil can supply. And that's our measure of drought, what's called climatic water deficit. And we accumulate it over the dry part of the season. This is an example of a climate diagram by Nate Stevenson from Kauai. So what does it look like when you actually model this? We take the soil, the top meter of the soil, we actually we model the soil water balance. When there's snow on the ground, when the snow melts, when it percolates into the soil, how fast it's drawn back up out of the soil by plants, what the wilting capacity of the soil is, etc. Now here's that same Tejon landscape I just showed you pictures of. We're going to look north to the left here. You can see there's quite a lot of variation in vegetation there, from these sort of thick oak forests on the north slopes to these open grasslands and woodlands on the south slopes. Let me show you what a climatic water deficit. Those are our study sites. And that's what the climatic water deficit looks like across that landscape. So you'll see, I'm going to back up for a second. There's a pretty striking relationship between the vegetation pattern there and the climate water deficit. The greener areas are areas where there's enough water to meet the demand from the atmosphere over the course of the summer. You put enough water into the soil that over that hot, dry summer, you still have some water left over at the end of the summer in the top meter of the soil. The driest areas, you've got about 1,300 millimeters that you could have evaporated if it was there. If you had another 4 feet of water, you would have evaporated it off, that kind of idea. But they're much drier environments. So I'm getting around now finally to the plants in the story, the plant's eye view. So the plant's eye view is a seedling sitting there saying, I'm a shallow-rooted little thing. Am I going to survive this summer? Is it going to be too hot? Is it going to be too dry? I'll show you the results for 2 oaks, black oak and blue oak, where we have pretty good garden data at this point. This is what our foothill gardens look like. I've shown you that picture before. Here's an example of the garden up at Tea Kettle. And you can see here we've got these little experimental plantings. We did 4 consecutive years for the oaks, right in the heart of that drought, 2012 to 2016. Wouldn't really have chosen to do it that way. But you can see we had pretty good oak seedling establishment there. Interestingly, this is looking from Fresno up the west slope of the Sierra. Here's Tea Kettle in an oblique view. This is the North Fork of the Kings. Here's where the blue oak woodland is, this green area here. The only place we could get blue oak seedlings to survive was about 2,000 feet higher up at Tea Kettle, experimental forest. So they're happily germinated and growing in these gardens with red fir and white fir we can't get anything started down here in this part of the, where the species currently has its range. Now that may be, it was warm, dry years, maybe it's a harbinger of things to come. So now imagine you can model the conditions in which a seedling can actually establish and grow. You take the garden data we have, you come up with a model that says a site is suitable or not suitable, or it has a certain probability that if you put an acorn there, it will actually establish and survive the summer. The areas that are green have very high probability. The areas that are white have no probability. The areas that are yellow or somewhere in between. The current distribution of blue oak is the purple areas across that same landscape. And this is our climate model going out from 2000 to 2100. The main reason I wanted to show you this is you can see this is the world according to seedling establishment. There are good years and bad years. There are windows of opportunity to get a population started. Like when you have a unusually wet, this is all model data. These are just downscaled climate models, but you can see how the landscape suddenly becomes much more available. So that's the way we've sort of thought about how to think about the future of these species. I'll show you one more view. This is for black oak. Oblique view of our Tejon highlands. This is ponderosa pine and black oak and brewer's oak, all sorts of really interesting species up in this part of the ranch. And I'll say, okay, if I run the kind of the same establishment model for black oak, this is what the landscape looks like, where the green areas every year for a 30-year period between 1981 and 2010, you would expect a black oak acorn to produce a viable seedling there, an established seedling. The purple areas, none of those years would you expect an establishment year. And then the colors in between are anywhere from 1 year to up to 30 years. So in that part of the ranch where it's currently pretty cool and wet, a lot of the landscape frequently is available for blue oak seedling or black oak seedling establishment. Now let's go to the mid-century projection. And that same landscape suddenly has a fewer windows of opportunity over the mid-century. And if I go to the end of the century, and this is just with a particular business as usual model, it looks like that. So there are still some places, some deep north-facing kind of canyons and so forth, where you can still model there might be cool enough and wet enough conditions for some black oak establishment. Now there's a whole lot more to getting population started, clearly, than just the climate. When we run our models, we run these population models where we have simulated fires and we can simulate competition with overstory plants and so forth. And one of the things that has the biggest effect on the landscape, you get more oak establishment in these establishment years with more fires, interestingly enough. You need somebody to disperse the acorns if you're an oak. There's always something trying to eat you. And there's these other effects of land use that go on over much of the oak woodland in California that we aren't really modeling here. So, just a couple of closing thoughts, and then I hope we have time for some questions. If you think about climate change, think about climates, plural, change in California mountains. There's just a wealth of climatic diversity in California mountains. It's really spectacular. And I think in some ways that's the good news. There's a lot of year-to-year climate variability as well, and that actually matters for this ratchet effect of populations being able to move, being able to shift in their distribution and abundance. You can't capture that with average climate data. You can only see that ratcheting when you think about the variation. The good news is when these mountains, there's quite a lot of climate buffering. So at coarse scale, the species look like they go extinct. As you zoom in and you get more of the variety of climates in these mountains, species hang in there longer. There are holdout places in the landscape for these species. There are stepping stones in the landscapes for these species. Bad news is, even with all that diversity, stepping stones and holdouts, microclimate pockets and so forth, we're still seeing very large changes in our projections for these species in these landscapes over the next 50 to 100 years. But I will quickly add the caveat that these are really highly uncertain models, particularly as we go further and further forward. So it's just trying to help us understand the potential risk for these species. Thanks. A long list of collaborators there. This is one of those things where you need climate atmospheric scientists and a whole bunch of other ologies as well to do this. How are we doing for time? Can we take some questions? Yeah.
Is California warming due to our proximity to the ocean more so than in general around the Earth?
So if you look at the projections, and right now the ocean has a kind of cooling, moderating effect. It's a nice, cool Pacific Ocean near the California coast. And the degree of warming actually gets more extreme as you get away from the coast. The coast actually kind of moderates the effects of warming more regionally.
So this is purely for the mountains then?
This is the mountains here in our study, yeah. And I think if we did the same thing for a coastal environment, you would see, I think, similar direction or similar trends, but probably not as extreme. One of the other things that happens, and you really see this in the dynamic regional models, is it gets cooler as you go up the mountains, but with projected climate change, the rate of cooling diminishes, so it doesn't cool as fast with elevation in these future models. I think that's going to be more extreme in these interior mountains, probably as well.
But didn't you say or show that the escalation of colder temperatures were the north facing versus the south?
So the north facing doesn't warm as, it isn't as, so if I think about the whole landscape warming, the north facing slopes are still the cooler parts of that landscape compared to the south facing slopes.
It's not anticipated to increase over the next.
Yeah, so.
It's the opposite of the south, correct?
Sorry, no, so.
Parity with one another as far as the climatic changes.
Right, so think about the whole landscape, cool, warm,
Yep.
everything's warming. But this north slope is now about the same temperature as this south slope was in a cooler climate. So everything's still getting warmer. It's just that the north slopes are relatively cool for that part of the mountain range. Yeah. There's not actually a local cooling effect. It's just that you moderate the effects of the regional warming on a north slope and in the shade or in the cold air near the streams and so forth. So it just buffers the effect. It keeps the warming from happening as rapidly, I guess is what I would say.
And what did you show as the correlation between precipitation and this climatic warming in the next 100?
It's
Does it reduce in a correlative sense?
there's a lot of
North or south?
no, because so the rainfall happens at a much larger scale. The storms are bigger than these microclimates. The main reason you get drier or wetter conditions in the microclimate is because of the heating and the evaporation that happens of the rainfall that falls. I would say the climate models such as they are now for California largely project slightly wetter conditions across the state, but when you add all of that extra heat that evaporates the water, it turns into higher and higher climatic water deficits. It gets drier even with more water because you evaporate the water out. Yeah. Yeah.
The blue oak, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like your plot garden and the blue oak, where the blue oak actually were, the lower elevation, none of them reproduced. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Did you take a look at larger plots as to actually what was going on there in the blue oak forest with each class of blue oak?
Have done that in other places. We haven't done that at San Joaquin. I think this notion, though, that there might be, I think I'm following your trend here, that maybe there are, again, these sort of unusually wet years, and we maybe just didn't get one in our experiment, where you get these episodes of recruitment, even at a place like San Joaquin. And when we have done age structure on blue oaks in other places, you tend to see some lumpiness in the age distribution. There might be kind of good recruitment years and then not so good, long strings of not so good recruitment years. And that would particularly be true in the drier parts of the range. That's why we're trying to model all this with these episodes and windows of opportunity rather than the average climate. Yeah.
Is any thought being given to particular species or particular ecosystems with keystone species using the predicted value of this kind of data to sort of head start? And I'm talking about large tracts.
Yeah, with you.
Where you
Yeah.
can predict the rains moving in a certain direction, upslope or northward or whatever, bringing in more active tree planting efforts to push things along
Yeah.
where they might not be able to otherwise survive in a very rapidly increasing temperature.
Yeah, this is the question, isn't it? How to manage forests under a changing climate. These are long-lived organisms. I mean, if you think about it, for these long-life conifers, they don't really even start to produce lots of seed until after 40, 50, 60, 70 years. So building a new forest is not a trivial problem. So I would say two things to that. One is there's a lot of genetic variation even within these species across their range. And if I was going to think about maybe manipulating anything about the forest right now, I'd first start thinking about genotypes and whether this notion that local is better is true anymore. That maybe those populations that may be more adapted to warmer or drier parts of the range might have an advantage in different parts of the range now. So I think that's a very active area that people are looking at, is the genetics of these species and how much they have this kind of ability to adapt to climate in different parts of the range. The actual active transplant, or what's called assisted migration of species. I think the challenge for me in that, and I'm not saying I don't think we ought to look at it, and people particularly for species that are very localized, very much at risk, they're rare, you might think about trying to get them started someplace else just to make sure that they persist someplace. The challenge is that usually there's something there already. You're moving them into what? Take a blue oak and put it into a forest that's already a well-established forest of adults, that of some other oak species or pine species. Get them out of the way to start the blue oaks. So that's part of the problem. So then you can say, okay, well, maybe after a fire, maybe after some kind of big disturbance event that's cleared out the landscape, should we at least experiment with some possible transplants and so forth. In a sense, forestry's been doing that a long time by taking stocks and planting them around to try to get better growth and better performance. I would say, though, that I would think about this more as a fairly more of an adaptive management problem at this point, of trying to understand what these forests are doing, how they're changing, and try to manage it with what we have right now rather than wholesale transplants. That's my philosophy on this anyway, yeah.
So the gardens where you planted the acorns, did all of those acorns come from the local area? Or did you...
I didn't talk about it, Ann, but we actually did common gardens. So we took the acorns for blue oak, both from the Tehachapis and from the southern Sierras, because we wanted to see, even at that scale, there were genetic differences. Whether there was a home team advantage, or whether, in fact, the Tehachapis were tougher blue oaks under drier climates than et cetera. So we've done all that common garden work. Haven't actually finished analyzing the data yet on that, so I can't really tell you yet. Yeah.
Back to assisted migration, I've spent several years writing environmental impact statements. I've been sitting here trying to get my head around how you would write the environmental impact statement. It ain't working for me.
Yeah. Let's take the sort of the policy constraints aside. What do you think about it in terms of whether you would want to do it at least experimentally or not, to see what the consequences would be? Or you just think you don't even want to look at that issue?
No, you could do experimental with a pretty minor environmental assessment.
Mm-hmm.
If you go anywhere with assisted migration on any scale, I can't get there on what you'd have to
Yeah.
do it.
What do you think about testing different genetic stocks of the same species? Different genetic stocks of the same species. How would that fare?
I'm not there.
Yeah.
I have a second question after that. But I've seen maps, census maps from the 19th century, about how widespread oaks were off in California. What retrograde information have you got? Where you can go back to like a year ago. A lot of, of course, was humans chopping down and but the range has to be something about.
This is one of the challenges with working with long-lived organisms, and particularly oaks, where they have been, they're in a part of California, those foothills have been pretty worked over at different times in history. So we have this sort of shifting norm, if you want, of what an oak woodland should look like and where it should be and so forth. And if you get back into historical data, you can actually get a sense that that baseline has shifted some. But I think we actually have a lot of experimental work and quite a lot of work now on the kind of physiology of oaks and their demography and so forth, where even though we can't know exactly what it looked like historically, fires, regimes were different, a lot of things were different in those oak woodlands. We do have a sense of what it would take to build an oak woodland now under current conditions. And that's probably, to me, more important at this point.
My quick
Yeah.
question is, has anyone looked at the oak genome?
Yeah. In fact, it's a spectacularly, it's a really fast changing kind of piece of science. So as people have, not both in Europe for the European oaks and here in California, Victoria Sork and others sequenced the oak genome, we're actually beginning to get a really good sense of how the genetics vary for things like valley oaks and blue oaks, and even which genes in the genome confer drought and heat tolerance and so forth. So we're very much an active area of research there. And the good news is with oaks as well as with the pines, they have very large genomes and a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of heterozygosity as it's called. Yeah.
What kind of restrictions do you run into with your LIDAR system? Like, can you figure out the microtopography of a forest fire, or are you restricted to kind of more slower?
So we are working with, and their LIDAR systems can be flown at different heights and with different instrument sampling intensities and so forth. So it's all about the details when it comes to LIDAR. The system we're working with is a 1 meter resolution footprint with about a 5 to 10 centimeter vertical precision. And when you look at places like Tea Kettle, you can actually see the downed logs as part of the topography. You can see a lot of microtopography. Of course, if there's a canopy, you're going to not get much return from under the tree. So what you're seeing is a lot of the soil surface and the soil features and so forth, the ground layer in between the trees, and then you get a pretty good three-dimensional structure for the trees themselves. But it depends on the system. Yeah.
Any specific plans for all the dead trees on the west side of Sierra? Jeffrey Pine, the west side. I think there's supposed to be something like 200 million dead trees on the west side of the Sierra.
Malcolm, you got any plans for those trees?
Are they going to take them out, or what? The forest fire has their beetles.
Well, yeah, so like the pines are mainly, it's a combination of drought and beetle kill. But to me, the magnitude of it is, I would certainly ask the first question of safety, public safety and things. So there are a lot of dead trees along roads, trails, near homes. And even that's a sort of a daunting task for this many dead trees. I don't know what the plans are for standing snags out more in the wildlands. But one thing I will say, and this is more from work in Colorado pine systems, so it may or may not apply if somebody knows. But the fire hazard associated with those trees is relatively short term. When they still have a lot of fine twigs and needles on the dead trees, at that point they're pretty much of a fuel. They can really propagate and spread a fire. Once all that fine stuff falls off the tree and you got a big standing snag, it's not as big a fire risk. So the fire concerns, we always have fire concerns in California forests, but I don't think all the standing trees necessarily change it that much after a few years. It's going to take a few years to go from that, what's called the red phase of the dead tree to the gray phase. Yeah.
I just want to talk about the giant sequoias, because after listening to you with all this, just made me have more appreciation for those isolated populations of sequoias. So you're projecting forward, but I don't know, can you talk just a little bit about looking back and why that is?
Well, I'm not the person to talk about sequoias. There are a lot of experts that have looked at those trees. I guess I would say they raise some interesting questions in terms of, again, the difference between what an adult can tolerate. They're on these pretty interesting, deep soils, extensively watered root systems and so forth. They've obviously been able to handle a lot of different climate variation over many centuries. Now, try building a new sequoia tree over the next centuries. That's the challenge, right? Those are really big, robust, resilient organisms, and even they showed drought stress in the last few years. But to try to rebuild a sequoia forest at this point, under this kind of changing climate, would be a real trick. I would say. Yeah. At least spontaneously. Yeah. Yeah.
Live down in Southern California, in the LA area. So I thought I heard you say that there's a possibility that those drought-resistant plants may have a better chance. But don't they also have a scale variability of which they can withstand if the temperature changes?
Yes, absolutely. So that I think if I'm following you, for the different genotypes, this is actually the challenge, is that no matter where you are in the species range, it's probably adapted to the historical climate there. So it's not as if, one part of the range, the individuals are going to have it easier than other parts. They're all under a shifting climate they may or may not be locally adapted to. So the question is whether you take genotypes from the drier part of the range and tried them in the same pine forest, for example, in a wetter part of the range, or the same oak forest in a wetter part of the range that was more like what they were used to historically, is the idea. Yeah. I mean, you're still playing this kind of leapfrog game with the climate versus the genetic variation in these populations. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Dozier.
So, are you using air temperature as a surrogate for the leaf temperature? In other words, what is the temperature that actually
Yeah. We aren't. I mean, what you'd really like to be able to do is not just the leaf temperature, but the stem temperature for those little seedlings, because that turns out to be probably what kills the seedling. If you get to lethal temperatures, it's the stem that gets hot enough that it actually breaks the ability to conduct the water up the stem of the seedlings. No, so we're just using it as almost as a proxy or kind of an indirect measure of the heat stress on the seedling when we measure the air temperature right in that same zone. Yeah, we're not actually putting probes on the leaves or on the stems. Yeah, then, depending on the conditions, the leaf is almost exactly the same temperature. There's enough water around, they'll be a little bit cooler because of the transpiration. Yeah.
All right, I think Frank would be happy to talk individually if you have any more questions. And please join me in thanking Frank for a great talk.